Hello and welcome to another PHP tutorial. So here we're going to be utilizing AJAX and PHP to return data from a database, which is going to be determined by the user input field. So a user is going to type in the letter A, for example, and we're going to return all the names that begin with the letter A. So think about when you utilize Google search, you type in something and then some suggestions appear. So it's going to be very similar to that. So here we're going to cover database connections, again, utilizing JSON with both JavaScript and PHP, utilizing AJAX to send and receive information, and also we're going to be utilizing SQL select where like functionality. So this is what we're going to be building, a simple search form. We have a database here with a number of names, and we want to search through these names without refreshing the page to search for a particular name. So using AJAX and PHP, we can just type in the letter, for example, A, and now we've returned all the names that begin with the letter A from this database. And then we can continue typing and so on. So this is what we're going to build. So I'm going to be utilizing Bootstrap for this project. So I head over to Bootstrap, go to documentation, and then I'm just going to utilize the starter template. So I've opened up Visual Studio Code, or just open up your code editor, and I've pasted that in. You can see that's what we got here so far. And now I'm just going to remove the last lines because I won't need those. I'll remove that. And now we have a template. And this is going to be called PHP AJAX name recall. There we go. So now we have the template in place. So we're utilizing Bootstrap here. So in the body, I add my first element, class container. So this is a Bootstrap container. I want to use light text because I'm going to be using a dark background. I'm going to have a margin at the top of 5. So next up, I then create a new container, and this time it's the row, and I justify content in the center. So the next element in here is going to be justified in the middle. This is how I get the center aligned box you saw in the preview. And now I've got a new element here. This is just going to be a column MD5. So this is just defining the size of the column 5. If you change this to 12, up to 12, that will change the size of your box in the middle of the page. And you can see here I'm using background dark. So I've got light text and I've got a dark background, and I'm using a padding around everything of 3. So these are all Bootstrap classes. So next up, I then have a header. It's just going to be called search for a name. That's what we're going to be doing. And then I create a simple form. So I just give this an ID of form. It doesn't really matter at this point. And then I've got my form group. So remember, Bootstrap uses a form and then utilizes form group. And then we define our label and input. So you can see here it's a simple text input. Class is going to be form control. And then we've got the ID of search box. That's what we're going to need to bind our data shortly. And I've got a placeholder. So the text by default is going to be inserted. It's going to say type name. So the last thing we're going to need is an area. So when we return the results back from the database, we're going to need to put them somewhere. So we're going to put it just underneath the form here in the new element here, this new div. And we give this an ID of search results. So by default, when we enter the page, it's going to say name suggestions will appear here. And obviously once we type something into the input, code will be injected into here. All the names that we return from the database will be injected right here. So XAMPP is installed on my C drive. You can see here, I'm placing all the files inside of htdocs. So the server's turned on, and now I'm just going to try this out. So I've saved it. It's called search.php. So localhost /search.php. And here we go. So this is what we've got at the moment. Obviously it's not working. So what's going to happen is we're going to start typing in letters here, and it's going to return the names from the database that begins with these letters. So for example, if I had the name Mike in my database and I typed in M, it would return back Mike and all the other names that begin with Mike. M that's in my database. Okay, so over to the PHP, I've made a new page called process.php, and you can see that I'm just using mysqli. Obviously, you can change this to PDOs if you want to. So here I've set out the server name and the username and password for my database, root and no password by default, and the database name is going to be called names. So we'll build that in a minute. And here we're building the connection. You notice that we put the details within the MySQL connect so we can build a connection to the database. And we just trap just to ensure that if there is a problem, we return that error. So let's build a database. For this, I've got, again, XAMPP turned on, and I head over to localhost/PHPMyAdmin to enter the graphical user interface here so we can add a new database. And I select new, and I'm going to create a new table here called names. Sorry, a new database called names. And then I need to create a table. So I'm going to call my table common names. I'm going to have two columns, one for an ID and one for the actual name. You could extend this also to include, for example, the meaning of the name, for example, or the origin of the name. So you can add more columns if you want to. Here we're just going to have ID and the name. So the ID is just going to be an integer, and I'm going to create that as a primary key. And it's also then going to be auto incremented. Every time we add an item to the database, it's going to increment by 1. So we don't need to actually enter anything there. And then we got the name. So I'm guessing the name probably up to 50 characters a name might be, for example. And I'm going to add this as a varchar type. Check out the other videos if you're not too sure about types and lengths, etc. And then just press save. Okay, so now I've got the database in place. Obviously, I need to insert some names. So you can go ahead and create some names. Here, I'm just going to create one name and just show you how you can quickly maybe add some more. So I'll call this Kelly. So that's what we need to do, and press go. So once you've got that, you'll see that some SQL appears. So if you were just to copy that, that's the SQL that we can use to make more users really quickly. So let's just open up a text file. So I've moved it here so we can see what we're doing. So what we want to do is just add in some more data a little bit quicker than one at a time. So if we line the code up here, we can just change where it says name and just add, say, 10 new names very quickly. We're going to need a comma in between, except on the final line, and then curly braces, and then Control-C that, and then go back into my database and then just select common names, and then go to the SQL, insert, not going to need that, and there we go. So I can press go, and there we go. I've entered a lot of names very quickly. So there we go. So in this example, I'm going to have around about 30 names in the database. So this is what my final database looks like. I've got a table here called common names, and I've got around about 30 different names, ID and name. Now we need to add some functionality so that when someone types in a letter in this box, it then utilizes this as part of a query. Query is the database for all the names that begin with A and then returns them back just here. So let's head over to the JavaScript first. Let's just actually install jQuery. So we're going to be utilizing jQuery. So we use the CDN for jQuery. Uncompressed to do. We'll use the script here. We'll just copy this into our head here. So that's jQuery ready. So we're going to utilize jQuery AJAX statements just to make it easier and quicker for us to utilize AJAX. So I open up the script tags and I've got my first line of JavaScript here. So what I want to try to do first is when someone types in a letter into this form, I want something to happen. I want there to be an action. So I'm going to be utilizing the key up. So here's different items that I could be utilizing here. I could use the key press event or the key down event. So I'm going to be utilizing the key up method, which is triggered by the key moving up. So when someone presses the A when the keyboard comes up, then the event is triggered. So this is when I want this next piece of script to be triggered. So first of all, I create a very simple variable. And what I'm going to store in this variable is the actual letters that someone's typed into this input box. So I want to capture that because I want to use this data to pass it over to PHP so it can then query the database for names that begin with that letter. You can see here that I get the input by ID, and then I gather the value, .value, and then I also just tidy up the value with trim. So next thing, I open up the Ajax, and now I want to pass some data over to PHP. So I define the type, which is post. So I'm going to be utilizing the post function to send the data. And then I collect the file, process.php. That's the file that we're going to set up the PHP on, where we may already built the connection to the database. Then we're going to need to define what data we want to send or utilize in process.php. So here, if you remember, we created a variable called search term. That's where we're storing the input from the user. And we're going to pass that over, referencing it by search to this file. Okay, so let's now move over to process.php, because what's happened so far is someone's typed in a letter. We've captured that information, and now we've sent it across to process.php. So now we need to do something in process.php to process that information and get back information from the database. So we've already set up this page, process.php. If you remember, we connected to the database or set up the parameters to set a connection to the database. So now what we're going to do is pass over this information. And we're utilizing post here, and we reference it by search. And this is the information that we're sending, search term. So what we're going to do first is create a very simple if statement. So we're going to check to make sure that the post data is actually set, if there is actually some data. So first of all, we check that, and then we open up the if statement. So we then take that data and we put that into a variable called name. So we now have in name whatever someone's typed into the input. So now we build our SQL statement. So you can see here that we're going to build a select statement. So we're going to select everything from the common name, where the name is like, and in this case, this is the value that someone's typed into the input. We're now passing it from this variable to here. So there's a few parameters here that we can set up to define what we want to return from the database. So if you take a look at this reference from W3 Schools, you can see that we can find any value that starts with A by referencing it like this. So that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to try and find any values that start with the letter, whatever someone's typed in. So this is the format we're using. But you can see here that there's different formats. So maybe you want to find where the value ends with a letter, or find any values that have or in any position in this case. So for example, if we had someone typed in A and we used this format here, it would look for an A inside of any of the names, and it would return all the names that had an A in the name, and so on. So definitely take a look at that, and you can change around the outputs onto the screen. So you can see here that we're using the input from the user, and we're going to utilize this in a way where we're going to find from the database anywhere in the names that are like. so the letter matches the first letter of the name in the database. Okay, so once we've got that, we then run this. So we use MySQL query. We take the connection and the SQL we've just developed and we run the result and we put it into a variable called result. So once we've done that, we then now have an array of data inside of result. Now, in order for us to format this so that we can pass it back into JSON, we're going to have to take all this data and put it into an associative array. So first of all, we're going to count how many rows that are returned. So we're going to use MySQL numRows, and we're going to count how many rows that are returned from the database and put them in this variable here called num. And then we're going to run another if statement. So we're running the MySQL numRows result. So if the result is more than 0, so if there is data returned from the database, then we're going to run this while statement. So here you can see that we're going to output everything that gets returned from the database, each row that gets returned from the database, and we're going to turn this into an associative array. So every time we output something, we put it into this new variable here, this data array. And you can see here, we put it into the right format. So we're going to have ID and name. So that's going to be the format within this new array that we're building, this associative array. Inside of here, if we return 10 names from the database, then there's going to be 10 names within this associative array stored in this variable here. So now it's in the right format for us. We can now send that back to JavaScript. So here we echo out and we encode it into JSON. So we put it into a JSON object, the data, and now we're going to send it back to JavaScript. Okay, so now the data has been returned, or it's been processed through the database. The data gets returned, and now we create a success. Now here we've got a new function, and the data now resides in this response. So the data that we just collected from the database is now residing in this response. And now we can collect that and output it onto the screen. So first of all, what I do here is I clear the search box. So imagine you type in the letter A into the input. You're obviously going to receive some information. So if I type in A, there's going to be lots of information appear here. So when I type in another letter, I want everything to be removed first before the new information is inserted. Otherwise, what will happen is the information will just pile on top of each other and it won't get removed. So first of all, we just remove all the data. Again, we're referencing this by ID. So this is where the data is going to be outputted here in this div. So we're just referencing that by ID. And now we're actually going to then take the data and parse it and put it into this variable called JSON data. So now we have the data ready and prepared. We can create a loop. So this is a jQuery loop. You can see here we take the data and we now just loop this out. So every time we loop out the data, we put it inside of the search results and we append it. We append the data inside of it. And what we're looking for here is the value. And inside the value is the name. So if we go back to the process here, you'll notice that we put two things into this array that we built, the ID and the name. So we're just calling the data back via the name. If I typed in ID here, I could collect all the ID from the data, but I just want the name. I don't want the ID from the data that we return. I just want the name. Now, if you're not too sure what I mean by ID and name, if you remember back in our database, in our table, in our names table, we're collecting everything from the table. We're collecting the ID and the name. So we don't actually have to select the name. We could just change the query to produce the name. So for example, if I go back into my process page here I said select all from common names. I could just select the name if I wanted to, rather than everything. But let's just finish this off. So now I have that in place. I'm now outputting everything. Okay, right. So let's just try this out to see if it works. So here we are in the search.php. I'm going to type in a letter, and here we go. So it's now returned all the names from the database that begin with the letter A. So it's gone through all of these, nearly 30 names, and it's returned the letter A. So I can now continue. If I type in A again, you'll notice that it now returns all the names that begin with AA. So it's not case sensitive. And I can continue, and so on. So obviously at some point it won't return some names. So there we go. So that's all the basic functionality. We can see here that we've utilized AJAX to communicate with PHP, and then we've utilized a SQL statement, a where-like statement, to return back information based upon the user input. So one thing here, there's a few problems here. If I press delete here, notice that I end up with all the names. Because if you think about it, if I'm pressing A here, that's going to return back all the names. So when I press up, it's going to fire off that function. So when the key press comes up, it's going to start this function or this code here. The problem I have is that if I delete here, then I've still pressed the key and it's still come up. And so it's returned all the data. So have a look and have a think to see how you could prevent this from happening. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any problems, just let me know, leave a comment. If you liked this tutorial, please leave a comment. So congratulations if you've managed to get your application working. So don't forget that these are just some underpinning skills. I'm looking for you to utilize these skills to expand upon them, to build upon the framework that I provide, maybe produce more effective code. Like I keep saying, maybe move into PDO statements, for example. So expand upon this as much as you can, and please let me know what you're doing if you are expanding upon these tutorials. If you need any support or help, again, just leave a comment and I'll try and get back to you. Don't forget to like and subscribe also, and hopefully see you in the next tutorial.